Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. You are listening to Latin Ways. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson. I'm delighted to be joined by Jorge Martí. He is the Secretariat of South Venezuela. Welcome to our show, Jorge.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
By way of perhaps situating ourselves, Latin America in the midst of COVID, in the midst of the war in Russia, seems to have taken a back seat. And yet there are many things unfolding in Latin America. I'd like to focus on the recent election of Milei in Argentina. Can we start by the significance of this presidency?
Yes, Javier Milei is a far-right libertarian. He calls himself a libertarian. But in fact, he is very similar to Donald Trump in the U.S. And Bolsonaro in Brazil, some with his own peculiarities. He is also seems to be mentally unstable, completely deranged. And he is proposing a plan which will basically roll back all of the state's intervention in the economy and in general in society. That is the extreme form of ultra-liberalism, in which all sorts of protections that exist, like workers' rights, environmental rights, protection against foreign companies, or any limitation to the free market and the unbridled reign of capitalism will be removed. And as extreme as this might seem, he won the election in December. So this is very significant. It's a major change in an important Latin American country. And I think it's an extremely reactionary move. And we need to try to understand why this happened and what are the implications.
It's not the first time that Argentina is in the highlights. In 2000, the economy in Argentina completely was collapsed. And we never associate neoliberalism, capitalism with the unfoldings of many countries in the world. So can we start by the situation, the economic situation in the country, and what has led to its more than, 200% inflation, a rise in poverty? Argentina is polling worldwide as a country in deep trouble.
This is the background to this election victory of Javier Milei. In fact, last year, Argentina had the highest rate of inflation anywhere in the world. As you said, it was at that time over 240%. As a result, a massive deterioration of the living conditions of the masses of the people, the workers, the poor. I think that the level of poverty went up to 553% in the space of just a few months. And obviously this led to a massive discrediting of all the existing parties. First, a discrediting of the right-wing coalition that was in power under President Macri up until 2019. And this was a presidency which signed an agreement with the IMF, a very bad agreement with the IMF, to extend the loan to the country, but imposing a series of very onerous conditions. And obviously the payment of the foreign debt became one of the main issues, one of the main problems of the government. They couldn't use money for social services. They had to cut money from education, healthcare, and so on, in order to pay foreign debtors. And this still didn't stabilize the economy. So this government of Macri became extremely right-wing government openly right-wing government of Macri became very unpopular, couldn't carry out many of the counter-reforms that he wanted, like the labor counter-reform, the pensions counter-reform, because there were mass movements of the workers, the trade unionists, and so on. And the government was defeated in 2019. And so the Peronists, or the Kirchnerists, came to power again. The Kirchnerists is a political grouping of the center-left, which takes its name from Nestor Kirchner, which came to power after the collapse of the economy in 2001 and stayed in power for 2 or 3 terms of office. Nestor Kirchner died of an illness and then was replaced at the head of this Peronist or Kirchnerist movement by Cristina Kirchner, his wife. And Cristina Kirchner came to power again after 2019 as was the vice presidential candidate, and Alberto Fernandez was the presidential candidate. It was never a very good coalition because Alberto Fernandez represented the more right-wing, pro-capitalist wing of the Peronist movement, while Cristina Fernandez was appealing to the rank and file, to the poor and workers who support Peronists for historical reasons. And the interest of these two sections could not be reconciled. So this was a government that was mostly paralyzed, managing the crisis of capitalism. Finance minister of this government, of Cristina Kirchner and Alberto Fernandez, was Massa. And Massa was the finance minister who signed the continuation of the loan with the IMF with the conditions that were attached to it. So this was a government that, despite having appealed to the workers and the poor to vote for them to carry out policies different from the policies of Macri. In fact, they were managing the crisis of capitalism and didn't resolve any of the problems. So this government also became very unpopular. Then when it came the time of the elections in 2023, they presented as a candidate neither Alberto Fernandez, who had been the president up until that time, nor Cristina Kirchner, who had been the vice president up until that time, but Massa, the finance minister, who was seen by many as responsible for the collapse in living standards, having signed the deal with the IMF. This was the worst possible candidate for the Peronists. And this led to a big collapse of the vote for the Peronists in this election in November, December last year. In the middle of all this, the discrediting of Macri and the right wing, the discrediting of the center-left of the Peronists, Javier Milei benefited from this. He came into this election saying that he was the anti-establishment candidate, that he was going to attack the caste. He said there is a political caste at the top that run affairs for their own benefits, and we need to cut public spending, we need to cut luxurious spending at the top of the ministries and so on. And as crazy as this may seem, many people said, well, we know the two other parties, we have put them to the test and they have failed, let's try something new. Even so, Milei did not win the election outright. In the first round of the election, he got about 30% of the vote, and he was only able to win the runoff election, the presidential election, the second round, for two reasons. One, because he was pitched against Massa, the finance minister of the previous government, who had become very unpopular. And in fact, the IMF and the international finance were supporting Massa at the beginning of the election campaign. And the second reason is because he got the support of Macri and the traditional right wing. So the traditional right wing threw the lot behind Milei, and finally he managed to win the election by a difference of 10 points in the second round of the election. Immediately as he came into power, he started introducing a program of brutal cuts against the working class. He carried out mass layoffs in the public sector. He prepared all state-owned companies and institutions for privatization. He passed a series of laws, one called the Omnibus Law and another a decree of national emergency, which basically tore up hundreds of pieces of legislation of environmental protection, of protection of the home economy against foreign imports, protection of workers' protections, and a whole number. I mean, it was really unbelievable assault, ultra-liberal assault against all the rights and acquired conditions for many decades in reality. This immediately led to massive opposition. There were spontaneous protests already in January, and there was the calling of a general strike for the beginning of January, in the middle of the holiday season. This is the summer in Argentina, and in the middle of the holiday season, the trade union leaders were forced by the pressure from below to call a general strike, which had a massive following. This immediately led to a cracks within the ruling coalition, a whole number of regional governors withdrawing their support from Milei, and so on. But nevertheless, Milei is still in power and is still plowing on with this program of massive attacks and assaults. I will say that the first thing that needs to be said in order to try to understand why he came to power with such an extreme program of attacks is because of the massive discrediting of all the existing parties. It is to a large degree the responsibility of the Peronists, which carried out pro-capitalist policies, that Milei was allowed to come through and win the election. On the other hand, I will also say that the left in Argentina, represented by the FITU, the United Front of the Left and the Workers, is also partially responsible, because in a situation where there was massive discrediting of all the established parties and a desire for radical change, this was not channeled towards the left, but was channeled towards the far right. And they have something to respond for that. The election campaign was meek. They did not propose a radical change, but they just campaigned under the slogan of, well, let's get a few more left deputies and maybe we can change this or that. And this was not really a very attractive proposition. Now that Milei is in power, I think that the scenario is one for heightened class struggle. The workers and the poor in Argentina have already started to see the real meaning of his policies. There's been a sudden collapse of his popularity, and as well as the general strike in January. Now the CGT, the main trade union in the country, has called for another general strike on the 9th of May. And this will be preceded by a national strike of the education sector on the 25th of this month, and then a massive mobilization on May Day, which is International Workers' Day. But this time it will be a day of massive mobilization against the far-right policies of the Milei government in preparation for the general strike on May the 9th. So in reality, Milei is trying to implement this ultra-liberal shock program, and what he is provoking is a massive response on the part of the working people, who have seen the living standards collapse even further. Inflation is still very high, but also many people are losing their jobs, they're being sacked from their jobs and so on. The pensioners have lost the automatic indexing of pensions to inflation, so therefore they've been thrown into poverty and destitution. The situation is really, really bad, and this is creating a wave of struggle now.
I want to pause for a moment, because I feel that the lessons we failed to learn from, we're bound to repeat, and when we think about the economy as a political economy, as a result of many political choices that are being made, few people understand that the IMF is an arm of the United States, and a way of exploiting other countries. The whole odious debt countries are requested to pay is simply for the audacity of being independent, of not, being the backyard of the United States for exploitation, and to have, unfettered access to their minerals, to the people, to the labor, to whatever it is they want. So by way of understanding the significance of this event, I want to bring us to Argentina, as Argentina and Chile, being at the epicenter of neoliberalism in the 1970s, and how throughout the region, the ripples of this violence of neoliberalism were felt. We in Latin America felt them as the dirty wars, where mass privatization of communications, of water, of all the essentials that people need became the norm of how, very few people enriched their pockets, and the people were left with having to basically pay for the right to exist. So can we talk about the significance of this ultra-right? Because we've seen the ramifications of having a Bolsonaro government in Brazil. We've seen the ramifications on immigrants, on labor rights, on women's reproductive rights in the United States, of having a Trump in power, and now a so-called Democrats that's also, on the right wing. We don't have a democratic government in the United States at the moment. So can we talk a little bit about?
Yes, in fact, what you say is very true. In Argentina and also in Chile, the implementation of these ultra-liberal monetarist policies of rolling back the state, attacks on the quiet rights of the workers, the peasants, was already carried out in the 1970s through a military dictatorship. In reality, in both countries, the ruling class, backed by the United States with the direct participation of the CIA, the IMF, and so on, they were very afraid of the revolutionary movement that was developing in both countries in 71, 73 in Chile, and all the way to 1976 in Argentina. From their point of view, the only way to stop this advance of the workers and the poor was through military dictatorship. And we're talking here about a military dictatorship, which in the case of Argentina resulted in the killing of disappearance of 30,000 people, and similar numbers in Chile. About 10,000 people were killed, tens of thousands were tortured, tens of thousands had to emigrate to other countries. This was also part of a series of dictatorships that also affected other countries in the region, including Paraguay and a bit earlier in Brazil. In reality, these policies had to be implemented, had to be imposed against the will of the majority through military dictatorship. In fact, Videla, who was one of the generals that carried out the coup in Argentina, said at one point, not so long ago, he said that the capitalists were demanding even more killings. They needed to destroy the layer of shop stewards, layer of trade union activists, worker activists that were resisting this kind of policies. So these policies were implemented on the back of massive bloodbath of tens of thousands of people. And now there is an attempt to bring back the same kind of policies. And the reason is the same as in the 1970s. I will say that in the 1970s, capitalism in 1973 and then in 1979 faced two major crises. After a long period of economic growth in the 50s and 60s, capitalism came up to its limits. There was a big crisis which was triggered by increase in the prices of oil. This conquest that the workers and the mass movements had won in the past could no longer be sustained within the limits of capitalism. They needed to be eliminated. And now we face the same situation since 2008, since the crisis of 2008. Capitalism is in a major crisis. This is not just an episodic affair, but it's an organic crisis of capitalism, and all the conquests of the past are now under attack. And this is the reason for the rise of figures like this: Bolsonaro, Trump, Milei, who the politicians who are not directly under the control of the ruling class, but they have the support of the capitalists, the bankers, the IMF, imperialism, because fundamentally they respond to what they need at this particular time. And this is giving rise, I will say, also to massive resistance on the part of the working class. As we've seen in Argentina, two general strikes have been called in the space of five months since Milei is in power. Bolsonaro also faced mass movements, first of the students, then the movement against pension reform, then the Fora Bolsonaro movement. He managed to finish his term of office, but by that time he was extremely discredited and facing mass opposition. So, these events are extremely reactionary and worrying, but I will say that our attitude should not be one of pessimism or despair, but rather one of hope, in the sense that we can see the beginning of a resistance against this madness of capitalism.
Not only is one of facing, head on our fears, because in many ways, I think what we ignore is that while they used tanks and military force in the 70s, their tools today, their weapons today are more subtle. They're more
True.
It's a form of soft power, right? So when we think about political choices, we think, oh, well, that's the law. There was a law put in place, but there's so many laws being put in place in Canada to prevent um, peaceful organizations and protests. The right to protest, the right to take the streets, the right to
Yes.
dissent are also being eroded. So understanding our role
That's
in
true. That's true of Argentina as well. One of the first measures of the new government under the minister for the Interior, Patricia Bullrich, was to introduce a new protocol on demonstrations, which basically abolishes the right to demonstrate. For instance, you cannot demonstrate in the middle of the road. You have to be on the sidewalk. If demonstration breaks this particular protocol, then the organizers will be billed for the policing of the demonstration. Is complete madness. Is an attempt to basically eliminate. And this is not just under Milei. For instance, right now in the United States, they have been arresting dozens of students at the Yale University protesting against the genocide in Gaza. In Germany, they've been closing down protests and conferences in solidarity with Palestine. In Austria, people have been brought to the prosecutor for crimes against the state for just expressing solidarity with Palestine. There's a general curtailment of democratic rights because, as we were saying before, capitalism in crisis cannot afford any reforms. They must implement counter-reforms, and they're also giving themselves the tools to prevent protest against these measures that they're taking.
Even with all the massive abuses that we're facing, people still taking to the streets to protest genocide, to protest, exploitation and the erosion of our civil rights. So in many ways, as you say, this is also a moment to recognize that we are powerful when we're united. We are powerful when we stand together, when we face our fears head on rather than run and hide and hope that, putting someone else in power will get the job done. So can we talk a little bit about the social movements that are also rewriting our history as we speak right now?
Yeah, that is true. First of all, there is no other alternative. What else can you do? You have to organize. You have to mobilize in order to defend acquired rights, which are now under threat, but also to advance and to protest at the imperialist policies, the genocide in Gaza, and so on. And this is already happening. I mean, here I live in London currently, and there's been a movement that's been going on for over 6 months, a mass movement in solidarity with Palestine and against the policies of both the government and the opposition of Labour Party and the Starmer, which are both complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And what I will say is that there is a new generation of young people who are becoming politicized in this period, in the period post-2008 and post-2020 COVID pandemic and the measures around that. And these people are not satisfied with meek reformist politicians like, I don't know, Bernie Sanders or Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez or people like that who maybe they talk a radical talk for a while, but they now in Congress and they're voting for military aid to Ukraine and all of these things, or they're coming out in favor of the so-called right of Israel to defend itself. And these young people, this new generation, they're not taken in by these reformist politicians. They want radical change, and many of them actually consider themselves communists. They want a root and branch transformation of the system, not just a few reforms or tinkering with the edges of the system. They want something completely different. And I think that this is a very positive development of the youth radicalization that is taking place.
When we start to create an image of the world we want to create, it needs to be a world where workers have rights, but our rights are truly protected by implementing laws that not only safeguard our rights, but also that create, a protection, right, for generations to come. Right now, the only country that has ever issued rights to nature is Bolivia. And of course, the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, has also been persecuted in many ways. So how do we co-create, with workers across borders, because it needs to be a global movement. It can't be something that we sustain in one area, because that can, we can be overcome by, interventions, military or political or economic. But we need to create a global movement where workers are standing side by side and protecting one another.
What we need is to rebuild a socialist, communist movement for radical transformation, not for reforms, but for radical transformation. Because radical transformation is the only way that reforms, which are necessary and useful, can be guaranteed. As long as the capitalists, the bankers, the IMF, the multinationals continue to have economic power, all of our reforms that we have won through struggle over decades will be under threat. So we need to rebuild. If you want, we need to rebuild the communist international, but not the communist international of Stalin, but the communist international of Lenin and Trotsky, a genuine tool for the emancipation of the working class. And it's not just a question. You are correct. We need laws that protect workers' rights, that protect environmental rights, that protect women's rights, that prevent oppression in all forms. But it's not just that. The point is also that the judiciary system is run by the ruling class for the ruling class. So these judges, who are they? Who elected them? The judges come from wealthy families. You don't have working class judges or anything like this. So they are biased in the implementation of the law. The justice system is not independent and neutral. It's a class system that responds to the interests of the ruling class. Or you have this farce of the so-called international law, international law, or the so-called rules-based world order, and all it means is the United States imperialism makes the rules, and anyone who doesn't abide by these rules is breaking the rules-based world order. Israel is allowed to carry out the genocide in Gaza, and the United States will protect it with its right of veto at the United Nations when the majority of the countries in the world are against it, and the majority of the people in the world are against it. So basically what we need is a struggle against capitalism, struggle against imperialism, the creation of a system which is based on workers. Workers create all wealth, and we should be able, workers understood in the widest possible expression, and we should be able to control the wealth that we produce so that we can use it democratically and a democratic plan of production for the benefit of everyone in harmony with the environment, instead of our wealth that we create being siphoned away into tax havens by a bunch of unelected, unaccountable parasites.
Thank you so much for being with us today. How can people access your work?
Yes, well, the Hands of Venezuela campaign can be accessed at handsofvenezuela.org. But at the same time, I'm a member of the editorial board of In Defense of Marxism, Marxist.com.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com.